Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about open data, open ontologies, governmental data, how other governments are actually using the available data and how they provide data for actually the communities to use them and improve upon them. So we should start with maybe the basics. What's actually open data and what fits into this category? Ian, you can take the word.
I've got the microphone, so I'm in charge. I just need to start off with. So what we see is initiatives, mostly in the public sector, actually, for government. No, I've got one that works. Yeah, to put mostly governments in Western Europe and the US, putting data into the public domain, data that they might have collected or data that they might have generated. So it can be transportation, it can be spending, it can be scientific data, research data that comes from publicly funded scientific research. And the reason they're doing that, I think, is because they appreciate that they don't have all of the answers or all of the expertise that's required to get to the answers, and they want to co-opt a larger community of developers and analytics professionals and software engineers and analysts to help them get more value out of this information than they can get alone. I think that's the main motivating factor that we see. And that data gets put to use in a lot of different use cases over and above simply answering questions that the government might have had when it first started the initiative of putting it into the public domain.
Yeah, that's great. We also just started here in Romania for having our data open. We're gonna probably get way better at this. We can go on the other side at Bogdan at what's
Hello?
open data for him. He's building an API for facial recognition. So how does open data fit into your
open data is valuable both for the public sector, as Jan said, for government data, but it's also important for driving initiative in the private domain. For instance, for face recognition, one very important aspect is to benchmark our algorithms and to compare them against other algorithms from around the world and from other providers and so on. And what's really useful here is to have open data sets, basically to make sure that you're checking your algorithm against the same information, against the same faces. To give you an example here, labeled faces in the wild is a very popular data set which basically all providers use to benchmark and audit their solutions. So this has been a tremendous help for us, both in terms of knowing where we are, how many improvements there are still left to be made, and to put ourselves on the map, on the same map as the other providers.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe you can tell us a word or two about open data at Telekom, maybe, if you have any initiatives in this kind.
Actually, we need to respect the legislation about the open data, and we cannot provide the data about our customers without respecting the law. However, we can provide you the data center that can keep this data, host the data, and let everybody to use them. And in my view, very important is the interoperability for this data, you know, because in order to put together many applications and use data, as in the example that we have seen before, you need to have people and organization being able to interoperate to access the data. If not, you know, we'll be like in a Tower of Babel. Babel, you know about this. So you will have the data, but you will not be able to access them and to use for cross applications. So we have the facility to host the data and to help all the developers to use these facilities in Bucharest and Brașov.
That's great. That's actually great. We can all agree that open data and big data is especially important in machine learning and all the software projects that involve them. But one of the biggest struggles programmers face is actually getting that data. I think Amazon Web Services also has an initiative of providing that data as well, and also having good quality data, like not necessarily having data. If you can tell us a bit more.
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things that we have worked on is creating a collaboration environment for public data sets. This includes a lot of different information sources. We announced just last week that we were creating an access mechanism for OpenStreetMap data and making that available via Amazon S3 and AWS regions around the world for developers to create clones of that data set for access, for analytics, or for incorporating it into apps. A few weeks ago, we announced that the spending data of the US government, so this is all US government federal spending, all centralized spending in the US, we'd make that available as what we call an RDS snapshot, which is a pre-canned relational database snapshot that any customer can take, clone into their own AWS account, and then build analytics applications against. We have the 1000 Genome project, which is a data set containing 1,000 sequenced human genomes available directly from Amazon S3 for customers that want to build genomics analytics applications. We have Landsat, satellite imaging of the Earth, available as one of these public data sets as well. So our model is to encourage the data owners to bring the data and store it in Amazon S3 in one of our regions, and then allow customers and other organizations that want to use the data to copy it into their own AWS account and then apply computational or analytical resources to the data. And it's the organization that does the processing that pays for the computational and analytical workload, not the owner of the data. We have this sharing capability with the public data sets at the center.
So you're helping the world to actually gather the data and putting it.
We're trying to make it accessible. We're trying to help data owners make the data accessible, the data they want to share accessible, to take your point about regulatory oversight. Data that the owners decide that they want to share, they can bring into AWS, induct into our public datasets program, and then make available for scientists, researchers, and software engineers to work with. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. If we go back to open data and all the initiatives to actually build upon the open data for the communities, we see a big discrepancy between the West and the East. For example, the United States has available a lot of open information for transportation information, subways, taxis, even taxis, where they go and how long they stay. What do you think the government should make, or maybe the communities should do, to actually encourage for more open data to be accessible and used by them to actually improve?
Yeah, you want me to answer that? I think it's a top-level policy discussion that policymakers need to have. I come from the UK, obviously, and there's a lot of initiatives in the UK to do this, but there's also a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the population in the UK, amongst analysts and scientists and researchers, that there isn't more open data. So the government is doing a lot, but I still think that the community is unsatisfied. And I think, to be honest, that should always be the case. No matter how much your government might do to put data into the public domain and make it available for you to work on and get value out of, you should always encourage them to do more, because there are always opportunities for more transparency, and there is always value and social good that can be created by getting this data out and making it available as a collaborative tool. So there's always more that can be done. In the UK, there's an initiative called the ODI, which I mentioned to you earlier. It's the Open Data Institute. It's city-level governments setting aside budget to create spaces and programs for collaboration around city data. So it might be air quality, it might be transportation, it might be traffic flows in pedestrian areas within the city. They're making that available as part of a drive to try and encourage collaboration with scientists, academics, researchers, and software engineers in the local city. And they're doing that because they think they can provide value to the population at large through an initiative like that.
That's great. Bogdan wanted to add something.
I was thinking of maybe having an example, because maybe talking in too high terms of abstraction can get a little bit confusing. About 2 years ago, we had a little bit of civil unrest here in Romania, and people took to the streets to protest and whatever. And I was like, I could do this, or I could parse all the data from the Chamber of Deputies and make a report regarding their attendance rate. So people know whether their representative in Parliament or Congress or Chamber of Deputies is actually showing up. And I think that the purpose, the point of this open data isn't just to show off that the UK government is better than the Romanian government, obviously, but the point is to provide some sort of public service. Governments should enable that by making data accessible, which unfortunately in Romania doesn't happen enough, not as much as in the UK or US, definitely. And then there's the civic society, or every one of us who can take that data, write a script, parse it through some big data engine, do their own logic to end up with some actionable intelligence which provides a public service. In this case, well, if this guy didn't show up for 80% of the time, maybe I shouldn't vote for him next time.
Yeah, there's a service very similar to what you describe in the UK called They Work For You. And it's governmental transparency, it's attendance rates, it's voting records, it's the expense levels that the representatives claim as part of their work. And they are a not-for-profit, so it's a charitable organisation that is working on governmental transparency, but they're working across many, many different domain areas. They actually started with attendance. That's one of the first things they did, but they've gone on from there to include these other components. Maybe there's scope to build something like that here, and that organisation can be a focal point for putting pressure on the government to have more of their data sets open for investigation. I think that's a really good initiative. Yeah.
That would be nice. Unfortunately, here things tend to move a little bit slower from the point of view of government taking initiative or at least taking suggestions.
Okay, you can check data.gov.ro. I just checked 5 minutes ago, and you will see the first portal that our authorities open with some data that you can check in the real time. It's working now. So of course we are in the beginning. We are not so advanced as in the Western countries, but we are moving also in this direction. On the other hand, indeed, it's very important to use part of the smart cities that you mentioned before. So there are some projects started in Alba Iulia, for example, also in Bucharest, where you can see in the real time what is the quality of the water, of the pollution, what is the traffic jump, where is the traffic jump, and so on. And they start slowly to build up. Of course, for this, you need to invest money, not only the government, but also the private company in order to build the components of the smart cities and to make the data available. On the other hand, very important is not to make available personal data about citizens. So you can access general data, you can anonymize data and use them for specific reasons, but you have also the right to not have for the public some info about yourself. And I think this is also important to know. On the other hand, in our telco industry, we start to build up some application based on the big data concept. This means that you may know where your customer, mobile customer, are moving during the day, in which areas, and you can take the data. Don't give data personal about name, age, and so on, but you can give this data to the companies that would like, for example, to do some marketing action. If you know that between 17 and 19 in Molbanasa, people between 18 and 20 years are going for shopping, you can have some targeted approach with specific messages for these people. And these are things that are happening now. On the other hand, of course, you can know a lot of data about, let's say, we have people that need some special assistance, and they should be monitored from remotely via machine-to-machine or IoT. So these are also data that may be available, but for some specific institution and not for everybody. So there are some flavors that we should take into account when we are talking about data, keeping in mind the privacy, but also what are the use cases that you can do with this data.
Yeah, I think one of the issues when you say about this is that, okay, companies have a lot of data and they can allow access to it, but you said they won't allow access to everyone, but maybe the community maybe a non-governmental organization that wants to make Bucharest a better city can take the data from a telecom provider and actually see where the people are moving, and then learn from that data, and then tell another company, RATB, which is the transportation company, where more cars should be at what hour during the day. But that won't be available, that won't exist if the data won't exist, because programmers won't have data to play with it. How do you see this thing resolving? Or you were saying, yeah, you were saying that companies should give data, but not to everyone.
Not only the telecom company, but also many other company has data about the clients. But you should respect the law regarding the.
Of course,
I
all
told
personal
on the other hand, have in mind again one use case. If you have, you need to build some to put up some sensors that will see the movement of the people, not only the mobile phone, but also sensor that will measure everything, the quality of the real life, I don't know, the traffic and so on. And based on this, based on the artificial intelligence, you can see, for example, when an attack may come. And we have now, we saw in the last days, the problem that happened in England. You can predict this based on the people movement. And you can have the police there before 7 minutes. So this is based, these are some use cases, application that can be based on data that you make available for special institution in this case, for example. But of course there are many, many other use cases, because it's not just you have access to the data and you should build something using this data. And it's very important to understand what you can do with this data and how you can protect the citizen also, and to have their privacy.
Yeah.
For larger initiatives like the one you mentioned with coupling telecom and transportation or public safety, I think it's very important to have what is called a public-private partnership. Because in some situations for large-scale products with a lot of data, maybe with some sensitive data as well, you cannot just put the data open on the internet, and if a developer wants to play with it, that's fine. You need an active conversation between the public government, let's say, and big companies like telecom or utility or whatever, in order to make these projects possible. Because if you just put the data out there, I don't think it's enough.
Yeah, what I can say for the UK, where the economic environment is pretty free, but it's also regulated in certain sectors. We've got Ofcom, for example, regulating our telecoms market. We've got Ofgem regulating our basically monopoly utility providers for water, gas and electricity. This is where there is an intersect where some of the data in the regulated industries can be considered data which has public interest and can be released in the public good. But that is overridden by the privacy issues that exist in the European Data Protection Directive, the GDPR and other privacy regulations that are there. So there's been quite a lot of work done in freeing up access to data which is generated by government and is essentially owned by the people, right? Because who funds government? The people. The sort of people own the data. The area which is being explored and opened up to a little bit more now in the UK under the same kind of framework are these regulated monopolies, particularly utility networks like water, gas, electricity, the rail infrastructure, which are on the sort of boundary between the public sector and the private sector. There's actually not that much happening once you go beyond that into truly competitive markets. Even in telecoms, very little telecommunications data or data generated by telecoms operators would be considered public data. It's data that's generated by commercial entities. They're free to compete with one another. The data is part of the product, essentially, and they will sell access to the data to prospective customers rather than regard it as potential public interest data. And I think that's right.
Yeah, that's true. We definitely need more transparency and make our government hand over the data. Moving on a bit, what are the major players that own the data, and do they make it available? I'm talking here about maybe the Wikipedia project that also started Wikidata, which is an database with all the knowledge. Freebase, which was a huge database with all the human knowledge need that was bought and shut down by Google. They say that they're going to provide a better API, the Google Knowledge Graph, which isn't the best thing ever, but other initiatives as well, Bibipedia, and also you mentioned Kaggle earlier. Can we talk a bit about the players? Where do programmers, if they want to understand, if they want to build a machine to understand general human knowledge, where do they go to actually get that data? And is there a central place? Does anyone standardize it, or should there be a standard for this kind of data?
I think coming up with just one standard is unfeasible because data is so different. You know, you have biometric data versus transport data versus electricity grid data. It cannot be encompassed in the same standard. But, you know, you should be a little bit pushy when Googling stuff, because you will come up against data sets which are open, maybe not made open by the government, but made open by universities, and that's enough maybe not to build an end-to-end solution, but at least to do a proof of concept. And then you can start from there. But, you know, depending on the use case, for instance, when I did the attendance project, I looked at the Chamber of Deputies. What data do they have up? And I don't think there's a recipe for that, but one thing that any entity, whether it's governmental or private or whatever, that is concerned with making data open, is also making this data readable. Not necessarily by humans, but by machines. Just to give you a small example, the government here in Romania makes a lot of data public because they have to by law, but they make them available. They make the data available as pictures.
Or PDFs.
Or PDFs with pictures in there,
yeah.
Which is terribly hard to use or to parse or to interpret in any significant actionable way. So one thing they should keep in mind is, you know, maybe you can publish at least the document or the PDF with text in it instead of scans or...
Yeah, I'd probably go beyond that and say that data sets need to be accompanied by a DDL, a data description language definition of what's in the data set. And I think there really needs to be an attempt to try and have a policy of not changing a DDL once published. So it can be extended with additional attributes, but you know, when people change APIs or change data description formats, it just breaks everything. So it's a good idea to try and avoid that. And this is another area where that advice is relevant, I think.
Yeah, that makes total sense. But at least in this part of the world, I don't think there isn't a lot of awareness or, to be honest, interest from the public sector towards these best practices in terms of designing your data set and API. Okay, you can extend it, but you only add columns to the right. I don't think they care about that. They just want to, sometimes I feel they just want to be minimally compliant with the law. And that's, if we are able to overcome that mentality, I think we'll have a great leap forward, because both private companies and private individuals are interested and have the knowledge and the expertise to leverage that if it's there.
Let's have a shift a bit regarding, we started talking about structured data. We can say that the internet is one of the biggest places where data exists, and it started to become standardized with schema.org, that everyone is starting to add more description to each of the page, what they mean, so that humans can better understand it. Facebook initiative with the Open Graph. Let's talk a bit about policies. For example, are you allowed to crawl all the websites in the world, and can you use that data for commercial purposes, for non-commercial things, or you're not allowed at all? For example, I have an actual example, IMDb, which is owned by Amazon Web Services. They don't allow crawling. You're not allowed to crawl IMDb, but Google crawls IMDb, and also IMDb has data dumps with all their data from the website. But why is that, and how can we use that data, overcome the impediments, and actually use it?
I don't know the answer to the question about IMDb. When he said you're not allowed to crawl it, I might have looked a bit surprised, because we've got a customer called import.io, and they turn the human readable web into machine data or APIs. So they will essentially, you point their tool, it's import IO, you point their tool at, say, IMDb, and this is one of the tutorials they have, which is why I know about it. You specify what's on the page, so roughly where you anticipate finding the fields that are of interest to you, and they will crawl, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of pages, and load that into an API, either on a permanent basis, which you pay for, or on a temporary basis, which the last time I looked was free. So I didn't know that IMDb couldn't be crawled because I've done it myself. So maybe I shouldn't have done that.
Well, their terms and conditions don't allow crawling. That's the issue.
Yeah, I think
you can crawl it, of course.
You can do it, but I think the issue comes when you attempt to monetize a data set which has been created by somebody else at their own cost. And this is back to a little bit about telecoms again. You've got your internal data, which you've spent your time and effort and resources, your stakeholder capital to develop. Should you make that public? Well, if it's got value, then the answer is probably not, because the stakeholders want a return off their investment in creating that value. So this is where things start to get a little bit more difficult, isn't it?
It is, but then you can say that it's general data. It's something that isn't specific to one company. It's like of interest to everyone. Shouldn't public data or data of public interest should be available to any public to use it in any way they want?
Maybe, but if you don't own the data that's of public interest, then it's just a hypothetical question about policy rather than something that can be implemented.
Okay.
You'd have to legislate, wouldn't you, to make that? The government would have to legislate to obligate organizations to release that data. I think you'd have a pretty hard time getting that legislation passed, because the organizations would lobby against it if they saw value in the data sets and didn't want to make them open. So I think it's a tough one to resolve. My basic premise is, my basic position is, if the government has created data, or the data's been created as a result of the investment by the broader populace, then the data set should be a public set. Okay, so if your tax or revenue raised from state-regulated monopolies or real monopolies run by the government rather than regulated by the government is the data source, then really the data is publicly owned. If it's data that's been created by a commercial entity, then the situation is different.
Well, you can also say that Google crawls all the internet and is making money out of it.
Yeah, they are, of course, yeah.
Why are they allowed to do it?
I don't know, you better ask someone from Google.
You wanted to say something?
This matter, I don't think you asked the question as if the answer was black or white. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, yeah, sure, there are some white cases where if the data is built by your money, then you should have access to it because you're a citizen or a EU citizen or UK citizen or whatever. But indeed, when you move into the private sector, where you move further into the private sector, it becomes a matter of private property, because data is an asset, and how it's being called nowadays, it's the oil of the 21st century. So if you spend your time and your resources and your people and your tech and your infrastructure in mining that data, crowdsourcing that data, curating it, maintaining it, storing it, well, then you kind of own it. And I don't think the government should be able to come into your business and say, you have like 50 terabytes of data regarding telecom usage, how about you make it open? It's not it's also a matter of the choice of the private property owner. And you cannot bypass that because it's private property.
That's true. Can you tell us a bit about the Kaggle initiative?
Yeah, so
that would be interesting.
Kaggle is a problem-solving community, essentially, where analysts and scientists and researchers can collaborate around data sets. And it's something that we've heard quite a few of our customers say they're interested in. And I think that it goes back to what I was describing before about the rationale, the drivers for the government opening up data. You know, the larger organizations in the world that have the data sets might not have the expertise that they need to extract value from the data sets. In fact, they might not even have the expertise to determine what the opportunities are in doing that, in working out what value could be created by analyzing a data set that they do happen to hold. So what we've seen with Kaggle is a gamified mechanism for analysts and researchers and scientists to work on analytics problems, essentially. And those problems can be generated by the analysts, research and scientists, or they can be generated by interested parties, or they can be generated by data owners. And I think this is a good model. That's what I was discussing with you in our earlier conversation. I think it's a model that could be expanded to include other kinds of problem and other kinds of community members as well. I just think it's an interesting area that will probably expand over the next few years.
Awesome. That's a great initiative. I suggest to take some questions from the public. We have one at the back. You can say it out loud and I'll try to repeat it if no mic is there. Okay, a mic is coming to you.
I would like to add something, not necessarily a question, that I felt was missing, especially for people who heard the first time open data. So a very important pillar of open data is ownership and copyright. So in order for the data to be open, it needs to be owned by someone, and that someone should provide it under a license that permits reuse and distribution. So if you have a sorry? Stop. Okay. So if you have a website that's public, then it's not necessarily open data, unless the owner of the website says this data is under Creative Commons or something like this. Okay, thank you.
But still, Google takes that data and uses it for commercial purposes.
You do have something against Google, don't you?
Yeah. They say they don't do evil, but they do.
Can I just say something about something that your comment prompted this in my mind, but I don't think we've really covered it. It's okay, and I would say that it should be encouraged for commercial enterprises to be built on top of public open data sets. I can give a couple of examples. So I've got a friend actually in the city that I live in Leeds in the north of England, and to say something about Leeds actually as a precursor, it's the hub for the NHS informatics department of the UK. So the National Health Service, which is the largest single employer in the UK with over 1 million staff, it's a central provider of healthcare in the UK, as you probably know. Their informatics hub, used to be called the NHS Information Authority, is in the city for the nation. Okay, so there's a lot of people in the city working on health informatics and information systems related to patient care. And our ODI hub, this Open Data Institute that we have in my particular city, and there are quite a few of them around the UK, the one that I have in my city is specialist in health informatics open data. So accessing data sets that have been generated by the health service and extracting value from them. And I have a friend who is the founder of a company who have built a commercial product on top of UK public medical data. It relates to prescriptions, so drug prescribing cycles. They process, analyze and create data products from prescription data to inform drug companies and license owners in pharmaceuticals about market trends in UK prescribing. So are certain drugs or generics rising in popularity while others are falling? And they provide a set of insights to drug producers about patterns in this data set as a product, which is a good example of building a product on an open data set. Another one, which is much bigger and much more international in nature, Citymapper. Have you heard of that, Citymapper? It's a mobile app. It started in London. Real-time transportation information. I want to get from here to here. How long will it take me? When does the next bus arrive? Is the tube system disrupted? What's the traffic like? Well, 2 of those 3 data sources come from public sources operated by the regional government within the City of London, the tube and bus. And they provide an API which enables app developers to build features about transportation into apps that they then sell. And Citymapper is a commercial enterprise where 2/3 of the product insight is built on open data sets in London, and their model varies in other cities around the world depending on what the data landscape is. But these are really interesting examples, in my view, of startups building commercial products, building businesses as a result of accessibility to data. And it's only because the licensing issue's been clarified that they're able to do that. If you didn't have a license in place which permitted that, obviously these businesses would never exist. So it's a really, really good point that you raise.
Okay, we have another question there.
Question. Hey, how do you think GDPR will impact open data? Because starting from the beginning of May, you will need consent, you will need data scope, just to name a few. and this will bring a big blow, I think, to the whole open data concept. I think all your industries will be impacted by GDPR in a big measure, let's say.
Does this thing work? I think it depends to a great extent to the nature of the data. I mean, GDPR basically has to do with information that can identify you particularly. So if it's statistical data, if it's just how many people were at the bus station or in the region of a bus station, and you are not able to identify them uniquely in some fashion, then I don't think that sort of use case would be impacted. But you know, if you're talking about individually or identifiable data which can be linked to you, like your purchases on Amazon or whatever, well, obviously that would be impacted, and there's a good reason for that, because you want the right to open data, but you also want the right to privacy and anonymity and doing your own business, basically.
Yeah, I agree with that. GDPR is a build on top of existing privacy regulations that already exist within the EU, and it relates to the same scope area which you've just described, which is personally identifiable information that allows you to identify European citizens. Okay, so, and I would say that open data initiatives which wanted to share that kind of data would also be already be very, very restricted by pre-existing legislation. So I don't think it will change that much in the world of open data. It will sure as hell change a lot in the world of enterprise data management, but in terms of impacting the edge of that, where enterprises choose to put that data into the public domain, there are already a lot of controls there which pretty much heavily restrict or prohibit that already. So I don't think the impact will be that significant in terms of change.
I think I can add something here. Bogdan, you're building a facial recognition API, so your data is sort of human faces. Yep. Are human faces personal information?
Yes, they are. In the definition of the regulation that you mentioned, it's called biometric information, the face signature basically, and it would be in scope. However, we have a twofold strategy to mitigate that, and that honestly doesn't have to do with open data, more with biometric data. So for the use cases where we just want statistics, how many 40-year-old males were in this room right now, how many 25-year-old females you had in the store at 12 p.m., we don't need to process or store biometric data in order to get that insight. So basically, we don't say that Bogdan or Ioan or Eugene was in the room. We just say a 25-year-old male, and that is not personally identifiable information. There are tens or hundreds of thousands of people matching that same description. And on the other side, where we do biometrics authentication, event check-in or venue check-in, we inform and encourage our customers to get the explicit consent of the customer before proceeding with said data. Just to give you an example, we are working on some use cases for event check-in, where you show up at an event like DevTalks, you just press a button and your badge gets printed out. But that should be an opt-in. So you tell your customer, look, if you don't want to wait in the long queue, give us your picture. If you don't want, if you're not comfortable with that, you have an alternative. So I think that's the approach around biometric data, to be open, to be fair, and to inform your customer, because an informed choice is at the basis of privacy.
Okay. Let's take one last question, if we have. No more questions? Okay, I guess that was it. I wanted to add one more thing, since we have 2 more minutes. I was more referring the personal identifiable information to the actual training, the training data that you use, not necessarily after you have the trained model that you apply to users and not store identifiable information.
Okay, that's a very good point. So for instance, for training our models, we can very well, and we use anonymized data. We don't need to know that you're Radu, you're Yen, and you're Vasile, and I'm Bogdan. You just need to know that you're user 7, you're user 29, and I'm user 107. And that's enough. We don't need to put in names or emails or whatever personally identifiable information in that model. And the best part about this is that the biometric signature, the face hash or the face signature, is not revertible. So basically, if I get the feature vector, which is basically 130 numbers, I cannot reconstruct your face starting from it. I can only use it to make comparisons. So basically, we anonymize the data and we encourage our customers to get an informed consent from their users for these biometric use cases.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna take more questions in the networking area. For now, let's give a round of applause to